Hello and welcome to this lecture on resource management. So far we've not been considering the availability or lack of availability of resources, but obviously resources play a big factor in our project scheduling and management. As the cartoon suggests, we are not able to assume we have unlimited resources. If you make that assumption, it's going to end up being bad news. You'll find out, of course, you don't. So this chapter on resource management has 5 sections to it. Resource constraints, resource loading, and then resource leveling. So we'll load them into a chart and then we'll level those, and then we can look at another way of viewing our resources, a different type of two-dimensional chart there where we have amount of time and amount of resources per day, view that in a chart form. And then last thing we'll talk about what happens when you're trying to manage multiple projects and the resources across multiple projects as opposed to just managing the resources on a single project. So let's get started. Types of constraints is the first of our 5 chapter topics. The 3 main types of constraints that a project manager faces are these: time, resource, and mixed constraints. In a time-constrained project, the work must be finished by a certain time or a date as quickly and efficiently as possible. And obviously, being first to market, getting projects done sooner is usually better than getting things done later. Time constraints can be addressed by increasing the amount of time worked, working overtime, weekends, holidays, increasing the number of people working, increasing the labor pool through staff people or subcontractors, increasing the availability of resources that are more efficient, faster computers, better machinery, improving the method itself. So we've kind of talked about that as well in the past. In a resource-constrained project, it's the work cannot exceed some predetermined level of resource within the organization. So it might be that you just can't go out and get another expert in a certain area. You can't go out and get another $2 million piece of mechanical equipment that is necessary. While the project still, of course, you want to complete it as rapidly as possible, speed is not the only goal. Resource constraints involve managing and extending the project out based on those limited resources. In the case of a mixed constraint project, and this is probably what a lot of projects are, it's really a resource constrained project, but within the resource constraints you're trying to optimize time to the appropriate degree. Mixed constraint projects can be addressed by taking the benefits and the best strategies of both time and resource constrained techniques. The second of our 5 topics in this chapter is resource loading. The concept of resource loading refers to the amounts of individual resources that a schedule requires during specific time periods. Once we load it into our schedule this way, where we're looking at the specific resources for specific times, it provides a nice reality check on the schedule. Is there any significantly over-allocated or under-allocated elements in terms of personnel or other kinds of resources? Now, Microsoft Project is a very powerful tool. It's not cheap, and most of you don't have it on your machine, so we're not working with it. But it's a tool that you can plug these numbers into and it'll give you your charts. And we can see this is a Microsoft project screenshot here. And just glancing at it, this is broken up into weeks. Not even specifically. Oh, there we go. So there's I can see this is January 4th, January 11th, January 18th, January 25th, and February 1st, February 28th, and then the months are broken up there in a slightly different area as well, but the columns are weeks. This week, this week, this week, and the activities going on are identified within the week. So assigning the bid is 40 hours, 32 hours occur during this week, and 8 hours occur on the week of the 11th, and so on. So Microsoft Project can throw that into us. But before you start using a tool like this, it's a really good idea that you understand the tool. So let's do this project here. Let's step through this to get an understanding. And we're not using Microsoft Project here. We're just using, pencil and paper. We have an activity table, and we want to create a resource loading chart. The chart, we see on the activity table that there are 7 activities, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and our loading chart, we've got the space there in the left-hand column for those 7 tasks, those 7 activities. And I also know this one's broken up into days, not weeks. You can use whatever level of granularity is best for the project, but this project is understood and defined in terms of days per activity, so we're using days in our loading chart. And right now I've got a big white box down here where we're going to fill in the data of our chart. So looking at this, our first activity, task A, requires 2 days, 2 8-hour days. And there's no predecessor for activity A, so it can begin on day 1. And that's what we see in our loading chart. We see that activity A begins on day 1. It lasts 2 days, day 1 and day 2, 8-hour days each, and we're good to go. Okay. So now looking at activity B has a predecessor of activity A. I can see it above. So activity B is going to begin when activity A ends. It's going to begin on day 3. And I can see that it has 3 days, 3 8-hour days associated with it, or 3 time associated with it. Time is defined to be an 8-hour day in this case. So I've got 888 in there, my 3 8-hour days for B. Likewise, C begins after B, so C begins on day 6. It requires 6 time units, which is 6 8-hour days, so I've got 6 8-hour days there, and you see what we're doing here. Now activity D is a little different than what we've just got through doing. Activity D has the predecessor of A, and A finishes at day 2, so activity D begins in day 3 just like activity B did, because both B and D have A as a predecessor. Activity D has 5 days of length, so there's 5 8-hour days associated with it, and so on. E begins after C, so E begins at 12 when C ends at 11. E is 3 days long. F begins after D. F begins at 8 because D ends at 7. F is 2 days long. And G begins after E and F. And I can see right now that E ends at 14 and F ends at 9. And G has both those as a prerequisite predecessor. So G has to wait until day 15 to begin, because that is when both of the predecessors have been satisfied. And now at the bottom of our chart, there is a sum of all the resources dedicated to that stage or that day time of the project. So I've got highlighted there day 3, and we see on day 3 that there's 8 hours being of resources being allocated to B, and there's also 8 hours being allocated to D on day 3. So the total time dedication in day 3 is 16 person hours, or 16 hours, or 16 units. So we've done our loading. Now we want to do leveling. So loading, if you want to think of it, it can be loading up the table or populating the table. Leveling is in going through and trying to minimize the effects of resource demand across the project lifetime. You don't want to have, do nothing, do nothing, do nothing, and then kill yourself on the project and then do nothing, do nothing. It's also the way you don't want to study in school, and you don't want to do many things that way. It's much better, if you want to do your very best, to to spread out effort over time. You're not going to write a very good research paper if you write it in one night. You're not going to do very well on a test if you wait till the last night to study for it. And you're not going to be a very good project manager if you end up wasting 4 or 5 days and then doing, 16 hours of work with no slack on one day when it's got to be done, 2 people killing themselves. Much, much better to spread that out if you can. So there's 2 objectives with leveling. Now that we've loaded, we want to level. The first is to determine the resource requirements so that they can be available at the right time. You want to make sure you know when resources are going to be available, make sure that they are available, they don't get overbooked or double booked at that time, and to allow each activity to be scheduled with the smoothest possible transition across the resource usage. Now this is a little longer of an activity here, but again, let's step through this pencil and paper. Tools like Microsoft Project can do this for us automatically, but we want to understand what's going on. I've got a little description there in the box at the top telling us what's going on. Create a resource loading table and perform the resource leveling. So first we load the table, then we level the table. Perform resource leveling on the project composed in the activities in this table. Now activities listed in this table are measured in number of 8-hour days. Time is a day, and it's an 8-hour day. And the maximum time used, this one has a constraint, this project does, 16 hours on any day is the maximum constraint. So this is a larger activity table at the top of the figure there, and therefore we'll have a larger loading table. The first 3 days are already filled in. You can see that A doesn't have any predecessors. It lasts 6 days. B doesn't have any predecessor. It lasts 1 day. C has A and B as a predecessor, so it can begin when both A and B are finished. So C can begin on day 7. It has 2 days, and so on. So I think you can see this is what we just got through doing. So I'm going to just assume that the fill part, you understand the fill part. What we're interested now is in the leveling part. We see that there are days that exceed our 18-hour rule for this project. Day 1, days 11, 12, 13, and 14 all have beyond the 16-hour requirement for this project. So we're going to have to not stop at loading this table. We're going to have to now level this table out. Let's start with day 1 here. And as it says, you can kind of read this along. Day 1 is problematic, but we have some options here. So we've got A, B, and D all contributing to our total of 24 on day 1. B has some slack and D has some slack. There's no slack on A. So, but B has a late start of 6 because it is the predecessor for C, and we see that C begins on 7, so B can go all the way up to day 6 before it starts and not push anything else. Likewise, D has some slack because it's a predecessor for E, and E begins on 9, so I can actually start D on 5, and still have 5, 6, 7, 8. D will be finished before 9. E begins on 9. So I've got some choices there. If I want to look at this, starting D, moving it over just 1 day, that has the least amount of impact on my schedule. So I'm going to take D and I'm going to slide it over 1 day. And you'll notice that day 1 is now down to 16, and where I now have D moved, days 2, 3, 4, and 5, they're still all within the 16. So that was a very, very easy fix. Now if we go to the more complicated case here, we had 11, 12, 13, and 14. All of them are over our amount. We've got to go through here and look at this. So G, H, and J are all creating there's no I there. I had to struggle. That didn't sound right, but they're leaving the I out, which is a good thing because it's capital I sometimes looks different things with different fonts. So G, H, and J, those activities are all contributing to our problem on days 11, 12, 13, and 14. G has no slack because we can see, and actually put the date up here in the chart this time. K depends on G, and K right now is beginning at 16 and G is finishing at 15, so there's no slack in G. H has 1 day of slack. H is a predecessor for K, and again K is at 16 and H is finishing at 14, so there's 1 day of slack on H, but then I start running into another problem there. Looking at J, J is a predecessor for L. L begins at 19, so I've really got 1, 2, 3, 4 days of slack right now between when J is being currently assigned and when J can be assigned. So I've got 4 days of slack there. So H and J have slack. H 1 day and J 4 days. Moving J makes the most sense because I can move, moving 1 day would help me with 11, but wouldn't help with 12, 13, 14. So I'm going to take those 4 days and move them, and I can look at my totals after doing so, and I can see, yes indeed, 11, 12, 13, 14 are now good to go, and where the move occurred, those days, 15, 16, 17, 18, they're still within range as well. So we were able to do that, leveling that way. So let's come up with a more generalized procedure for this. This is talked about in our book here. How do we do leveling? Very high level overview, create the project activity network diagram, use that to load the table, and then mark the late finish dates on the table, which is something we didn't do specifically before. We were kind of doing it ad hoc. If we wanted to be more systematic with this, we would go through each one of our activities, and you can see that A has an end date there, and the late finish, or the slack is shown that there isn't one at A. I can see there's 1 day of slack available on B because my end date could be 12. It's 11. There's nothing on C, no slack. D has some slack in there. Again, these are based on the predecessors and what are depending on them. E has some slack, none for F. G has some slack, none for H. A lot of slack on I. They did use I this time. I don't know why they didn't last time. J has slack and no slack on K. So once I load the table and then go that extra step of marking the late finish dates on our table, that gives me the ability to do the next step in our activity, which is identify any resources or conflicts and begin to smooth out the loading table using one or more of the heuristics for prioritizing resources across activities. And this is what our book describes. I think I summarized 1, 2, and 3, shortened those down. But that's, I think, verbatim how our book says it. And then step 5 is repeat the step 4, identifying sources to be smooth based on heuristics, and do that as necessary until you've eliminated the source of the conflicts. Well, what do we mean by heuristics? That's all great and well if we understand what we mean by a heuristic. Let me take just a quick second here and highlight the word heuristic and put this in a little bit of a context. Complex problems are almost impossible to guarantee mathematically optimal solutions. Most things in life you have to deal with a certain amount of uncertainty. Heuristics, or sometimes you call these a rule of thumb, these are what we do on an everyday basis that help us deal with complex problems and find good enough solutions. This is actually a pretty big deal in computer science because computers don't have rules of thumb or common sense or what we might call heuristics. You have to pre-program things out, and it's very difficult with computers to do that. And there are certain things that, so this field of study is in computer science, but you don't need to know anything about computer science to understand heuristics. We use heuristics all the time. When you go look for a parking place, you don't know, unless you've got a reserved spot for yourself, you don't know where you're going to park. But depending on the time of day and where you're going, you have an inclination about where you're going to look for a parking place. On campus at 9 o'clock on a Monday, you're going to look at a parking place very different than if you're on campus at 3:30 in the afternoon looking for a parking place. You'll drive to different places and look different places. If you're going to Walmart in July at 8 p.m. On a Tuesday, you're probably going to expect to park in a different place than if you're going to Walmart in the middle of December, a week before Christmas, 2 weeks before Christmas, on a weekend, on a Saturday weekend at 1 o'clock. You're not going to find a parking place. You're going to be happy parking within, anywhere in the parking lot at all, as opposed to parking across the street or at, Red Lobster and walking there. So we use heuristics all the time. It's non-mathematical, non-guaranteed solutions, but it's for good enough behavior. Okay. Now, when we're doing these algorithms, the reason we're talking about this here is and here's I forgot I had this cartoon. So here's an example of a heuristic, and I always like Dilbert because they does a good job of illustrating our points here. The boss is saying, "I don't think I have your full attention," and Alice is saying, Asok, the intern, he's doing the listening right now, and if you, the boss, say anything useful, the intern will send us an instant message. And the boss says, well, he's asleep. And she says, he's employing heuristics, which means it's probably a good safe guess, not guaranteed, but it's probably a good safe guess that nothing is going to be said that needs to be texted. So, okay, there's our Dilbert joke. So we're talking about leveling. The reason we had that little tangent there is our fourth rule was to level based on heuristics. So what are some heuristics for leveling? These 5 are discussed in the book. Consider activities with the smallest slack. They might be candidates for leveling. Consider the activities with the smallest duration. Activities that earlier in the task, early task first come, first serve. Activities with the most successor tasks. Activities that require the most resources. You may want to dedicate resources or move tasks that direction. For example, that first rule, prioritizing activities with the smallest slack. That's a good for minimizing slippage. That fourth rule about activities with the most successors, the advantage of throwing resources there, of getting that done sooner than later, of focusing on it, is that it may free up the most activities once it's completed, and so on. So none of these is guaranteed in every situation to be the best, but it's rather than just going through and making any legal random move as you start trying to negotiate and level. It gives you some rule of thumbs to follow. So here's our table. It's not that we have a hard constraint, but we're just looking at this table, and I see that day 12 is the highest resource use in this project. It's got 10 associated with it, nothing else. Everything else is single digit. So if I wanted to try to level this, if I wanted to try to minimize the activity on day 12, I would have a couple options there. I can't do anything with C because the 4 days that are coming from activity C on day 12, it's at its hard late finish. D has a few days associated with it. I can move D over some, but I still, even if I move it over those 2 days, which is my gap here on day D, I have day 16 and 17 and 18, 3 days, I'm sorry. I'm still going to have a conflict on day 12 if I move it over. Project activity E has 1 day available, and if I move it, that's actually going to free it there. So I might actually try that. And by moving this activity E from day 12, no longer there, I've shifted it over to day 22. Notice that day 22 was empty for E, and now day 22 has a value in E. I'm down to 7 on day 12. Great, but that shift has a repercussion. Now if I add up day 22, I've got 3 plus 2, 5 plus 4, 9 plus 2, I've got 11. And that's a problem, so I want to shift something there. And again, looking at this, I can take the 3 days that were on 22, 23, 24 for J, make J now have 23, 24, 25. And now I've got a 7 on day 12, I've got a 9 on day 22, and in fact that entire week is 99997, whereas it was originally 89977. None of my total resources are above 9, they're all single digits, and I've done some shifting. Are there other ways that I could have shifted, done more shifting or less shifting? Absolutely. As they get more complex, the need to use those heuristics as you go along becomes more important. The fourth of our 5 activities in our chapter today is resource load charts, loading charts. Now this is another way to visually understand and approach the resource management problem. And a loading chart is you're displaying the amounts of the resources as a function of time on a graph. So we're doing resources over time. So this can be done, again, we can have our initial network diagram. We can create a table where we specify the resource, duration, early start, slack, and late finish information for each item on our chart, which is another way of looking at the same data. And here's another way of looking at the same data. This resource chart, resource loading chart, shows the same information. Specifically, for activity A, I can see on our chart here that the duration is 4 days, and project days is across the bottom of my chart, and this one is broken into units of 2. So there's day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. So I'm using 4 days for activity A, and the resources, 6 resources. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 resources. So my resources is my A box is 6 resources high and 4 resources across. That's a nice way of displaying that I've actually got 6 times 4, 24 units of resources here. Now a day and a resource are not exactly the same, so I wouldn't over state the fact that we've got 24 units here, but it does help us understand that day and resources together are what we're talking about. B, on the other hand, I can see that it's only 1 across. Even if I didn't have the chart above, I can see that the days for B is 1 day. Looks like it's from 4 to 5, and I can see the resources are 2. It looks like I've got from 2 to 3 and 3 to 4 on this chart. Now it's sitting on top of C, so I only count the height of B. So B has a height of 2 resources and a width of 1. C has a width of 3, 4 to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7, and it has a height of 2. And again, I'm seeing that same information. C has a width of 3, duration of 3, and a resource height of 2. And I can draw my chart out this way. Also, the position of the blocks are based on our early start dates. So 0, 4, 4, 5. Notice on D, it could have started on 5, but we actually, in this chart, it's already been pushed over to 7 so that it's not stacking up, because it would have actually been stacked up here a little bit higher. So we can shift these blocks around to try to level the resources. In fact, that's what our book says specifically to do. So create the diagram, create the table, draw things together based on the initial early start time, and then 5 and 6, and this is kind of our heuristic, non-specific, non-algorithmic, trial and error. Rearrange the activities within their Slack to create a profile that is as level as possible. In other words, the top, you add up all the resources, you want it to be kind of smooth within the guidelines of not changing the duration of activities or their dependencies. Use your judgment to interpret and improve activity leveling by moving activities with extra slack in order to smooth the resources across the project. So just stating that resource loading chart process again here in a quick summary, a 4-step summary. First, start with your network diagram. Based on that network diagram, produce a table that shows the duration, early start, late finish, slack, and slack resources. Early start, late finish, slack. Okay. Draw your chart. Now here our chart, we can see that days 7 to 11 have the most resources allocated to them. D by itself requires 7 resources for those days. We can say that right now we're using our resources least effectively on days 5, 6, and 7. Or 5 and 6, we're using our resources ineffectively because there's only 2 resources being used on those 2 days. So one way of looking at this chart, my goal might be to try to balance the resources, and we talked about the advantage of doing that. Another way of looking at this, there might be a hard cap. I might say you can't go above 6, and that'd be a real problem in this project because D requires above 6. But whether we're trying to just level it to reduce the imbalance, or whether we're trying to meet a hard constraint, we can deal with the information in this 2-dimensional resource day 2-dimensional view as easily as we can on charts here. So one of the things that we did to try to level this, and you'll notice, let me go back to where I was, we went from 2 to 7. That was our resource imbalance in this new chart after we've done some leveling here through a loading chart. We're going from 4 to 7. So we're more balanced with our resources. Now, how did we do this? Again, here's where we were. Whoops. Here's where we were, and here's where we are. How did we get here? C is what changed. C has 2 resources across 3 days. One of the things you can do is you can split the resource. So it's still 2 resources for 1 day on day 5, and then 2 resources for 2 days on, looks like 9 and 10. The lines aren't super good. They're a little bit off. But you're splitting the process. So splitting refers to starting activity, interrupting it to allocate those resources elsewhere, and then coming back and finishing up the activity. Some things can't be split up this way. Right? You can't do something as if you're pouring concrete and it takes 2 days to pour the concrete for a certain activity. You might not be able to do day 1 and then come back 3 days later and do day 2. It might be inefficient in terms of getting the resources there, the manpower there, or whatever. But some projects can be broken up and split into a certain part of the project now and a later part of the project later, and that's called splitting. The last part of our chapter coverage here is multi-project environments. Everything we've set up to this point is about managing resources, which is very important for a single project, and that's complicated. Well, guess what? When you're managing multiple projects, it gets even more complicated. And you're sharing resources, especially when resources are shared between multiple projects, which typically they are. Human resources, physical resources, they tend to be shared. So it really becomes an issue of trying to handle this. Multi-project resource management, it adds complication to an already complex task. When addressing multi-project resource allocation, one must consider as much as possible the need to minimize negative effects of 3 parameters: schedule slippage, resource utilization, and in-process inventory. So slippage is related to time of the project. The resource utilization is the available resources, and then in-process inventory, amount of work waiting to be completed but delayed. So again, when you're when you're ready to do something, you're working on a project in your home, but before you can move the furniture and you've got to clean the carpet, before you can put up the drywall, you've got to make sure that the wiring has been laid and been inspected and verified. You can actually cause other projects to delay in this in-process inventory. So we have some heuristics. Again, the reason we have heuristics is because typically you can't come up with an absolute mathematical guaranteed optimal solution. You're dealing with complexity. And we deal with complexity as humans amazingly well by having these rules of thumbs. So some rules of thumb, some heuristics to talk about in the text. The first in line heuristic. This allocates resources based on which project enters the queue first. So first come, first served. We might say it that way, FCFS, first come, first serve. Whatever in the queue first. This is very fair. There's no biases based on, this project is from so-and-so and he's more important in the company. It's just who comes in first to request resources gets it. The actual dates and lengths of the task are not considered. The source of the activity is not considered. It's kind of like standing in a grocery line with only a grocery store with only a single checkout line. It'd be frustrating to just try to get one or two things and have somebody in front of you that's got a cart full of lots and lots of items. But it's fair, they got in line before you did. So each of these heuristics has advantages and has its disadvantage. This heuristic is easy to follow, but sometimes it defies common sense. You'd say, it really makes more sense for me to check out in front of you, and it really makes more sense for me to do this little project that doesn't require many resources than it is to do your great big project that has all these resources for any number of reasons. The greatest resource demand. This heuristic or decision rule determines which projects in the company's portfolio will pose the greatest demand on available resources, and you allocate those resources first. Now, why do you allocate resources first? Well, projects with a lot of demand are very likely candidates for being bottlenecks. If you've got to get 10 people working together, and when it comes time to do that project, 9 of those 10 people are available, but the 10th person's already committed to something else, because he got in line first on some other activity, some other project allocated him, then you're going to have 9 people waiting. So high resource projects may make sense to be higher in your heuristic or decision rule about determining how to schedule. Same thing with resource utilization, very, very similar to greatest resource demand. Greatest resource utilization, it's just a slight variation on that. Projects with the highest utilization are scheduled first. And again, the goal is to get a good performance measure and to minimize bottlenecks. The danger with both greatest resource demand and greatest resource utilization heuristics is that worthy projects that don't require a lot of resources, they're being biased against. So, you just want to get 2 people together to do something very simple. It's going to be very valuable to the company because they don't demand a lot of resources or utilize a lot of resources. They're biased against in this heuristic, and you can kind of start to see that things get a little complex. Minimum late finish time. This prioritizes projects with the minimum slack. Projects with the earliest late finish date are scheduled first. The goal here is to keep projects as close as possible to schedule. Projects with more slack, they can wait for their resources without the project being pushed back. Once you start missing late finish dates, then obviously you're pushing the project back as well. The danger is that resource starvation occurs against projects that seem to have a lot of slack. Again, a good project that has some slack into it is biased against with this approach, just like the greatest resource biases against good projects that don't need a lot of resources. Now, I've said all this stuff about heuristics, and this is the last slide, so we're done after this. Mathematical programming is an approach, and I really almost should not have this under our heuristics here, because it's not heuristic based. It will achieve an optimal solution. If you can do the idea behind mathematical programming is you can make optimal decisions to resource constraint problems. You say, oh, well, that's great. Why am I even bothering with all this heuristic stuff? I just want to do the mathematical programming approach. The problem is it's a very limited use because it's extremely complex, extremely large number of computational variables, and takes a long time just to set it up, let alone to generate the results. So having the right knowledge and having the accurate knowledge and even knowing exactly what that information is It takes heuristics to be your assumptions, your inputs into your mathematical programming model. But if you had absolute perfect knowledge, and if you had everything into the system, you actually could come up with an optimal solution. The deal is, it's sometimes not worth the time it takes to verify it's optimal. Is not going to, the optimal solution isn't that much better than a good enough solution you can get with heuristics. And again, we make these decisions all the time. When you're driving somewhere, you just go on your own. You're not absolutely calculating out the exact best solution. Driving somewhere, getting GPS information and helicopter satellite photos or anything, helicopter photos, satellite photos. I know how to get there, and if there's a little bit of a delay and it costs me a few minutes, it doesn't matter. The time it takes to figure out the absolute optimal perfect solution isn't worth the effort it gets. And even then, my assumptions on my absolute perfect optimal driving solution, they may be wrong, because a crash may occur on a road after I get started and I'm down a certain path or road, literally, and all of a sudden it's not the optimal solution anymore. So even those variables there. But the idea with mathematical programming is you can come up with solid, correct answers. So there's our lecture on resource management.